Good day, citizens, and welcome to this week's Thomas Jefferson Hour, the podcast edition.
The podcast issue of the Jefferson Hour. And this week, really satisfying and delightful interview with Peter Stark of Missoula, Montana, the author of a relatively new book on the young George Washington called Young Washington, How Wilderness and War Forged America's Founding Father.
This was a really fun read.
Well, it's such an utterly interesting story that young Washington was a bit of a bumbler. He's vain, he's whiny, he's erratic. He hasn't yet absorbed the great Stoic wisdom that led him to be one of the most remarkable men of the American Revolutionary period. He's sort of figuring himself out there on the frontier, fiercely ambitious and totally insecure. And he winds up playing a significant role in the early phases of the French and Indian War.
Well, it's been a couple of weeks of fun with Washington, if I could put it that way.
Fun with Washington.
Yes. Last week we talked to President Jefferson, and this week we talked to the author Peter Stark. I have to say that, Washington is somebody that I feel deficient in my knowledge of. So I was really glad to spend some time. If I was doing my homework, I'd probably read Chernow's Washington.
Chernow has a huge tome on George Washington. There's also Richard Norton Smith's Patriarch, which is my favorite
you mentioned that.
single-volume book on Washington. Flexner wrote a book called The Indispensable Man, which set that title for all time about Washington's centrality to all this. John Marshall, Jefferson's cousin, wrote a 4-volume biography of George Washington, which Jefferson said was like a mausoleum, like hagiography.
I remember that.
And so there's a huge historiography on Washington, but, he's seen as kind of a wooden, stiff, aloof.
Not so much in this book.
But not in this book. This is the young adolescent Washington.
Aggressive, ambitious.
Striving to make his name in the world and totally obsessed with honor and reputation in a way that it's hard for us to understand in this much later age in American history.
Well, we're going to keep this short and go to the show, but I do want to invite listeners, if you have a question for President Jefferson, go to jeffersonhour.com. If you'd like to make comments on the show, suggestions, that's the place to do it. And, if you would like to support the show, and we need your support.
We need your support.
You can join the 1776 Club, that way support the show, or other ways. Go to jeffersonhour.com and click on donate.
And the cultural tours,
we appreciate
American
that.
Space Program, Charles Dickens, Jefferson in France. It's just...
it's all there.
It's all there. Go to jeffersonhour.com. Listen to the show now.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson, when he's here, is portrayed by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay Jenkinson.
David, we have a really extraordinary guest on today's program. I've known him for a long time. I've enjoyed his work, particularly his book on Astoria. His name is Peter Stark. He lives in Missoula, Montana, and he has a new book, 2018, called Young Washington, How Wilderness and War Forged America's Founding Father.
Yes, it was a great conversation. We started by asking Peter to tell us a little bit about himself.
I live in Missoula, Montana with my wife, Amy Ragsdale, and raised 2 children here. The reason I ended up in Missoula was I got a degree, an undergraduate degree at Dartmouth in anthropology and English, and then a master's degree in journalism at the University of Wisconsin. And then I wanted to go to someplace remote and mountainous to start a journalism career. And I kind of randomly ended up in Missoula because I heard it was a good place to live and very outdoorsy. And I've come from a very outdoorsy and adventurous family. And so I ended up, writing for the newspaper here for a couple of years, writing features. And then I went out on journalism on my own, and I started writing about outdoor things and adventures for Outside Magazine and for Smithsonian and other publications like that. And so I've been an adventure writer for most of my career. And as I've gotten older, and as we had children, instead of doing these crazy adventures myself, like paddling down unpaddled rivers in Africa in kayaks and that sort of thing, I decided to write about the history of exploration, which I love doing. And so that's how I got involved with a story about young George Washington. I'm not a presidential biographer. I come at the story from the wilderness and adventure side. And I stumbled across the story when I was in Western Pennsylvania some years ago. I was doing a profile of very unpopulated places in the United States, and I was in Western Pennsylvania, and I heard the story about young George Washington stumbling around, actually thrashing around in the wilderness out in Western Pennsylvania, and I'd never heard of it before. I'd never heard that story, and I became intrigued with it, and I've always been intrigued with individuals, humans, explorers in wilderness situations faced with the unknown. And there's George. That's what we're dealing with here.
Hey, I want to read something from the beginning of your book. We all have these images of Washington that people my age grew up with learning about him in school. It says, you wrote, "This is not the Washington possessed of nearly superhuman virtue, who, given the chance to consolidate power and the rule indefinitely over the just-born nation, willingly stepped down and returned to a quiet life on his Virginia plantation. Rather, this is the young Washington, but not the Washington of the cherry tree bedtime story. This young Washington is ambitious, temperamental, vain, thin-skinned, petulant, awkward, demanding, stubborn, annoying, hasty, and passionate."
He's not the Washington that we know, this guy. In his early 20s, he's really kind of a mess. And he's thrashing around in the wilderness trying to make a name for himself. And he's finding himself in all sorts of very difficult situations. And that's what I found fascinating. And I also think that this early version of Washington is almost more inspiring and more accessible, given where he started and how he eventually figured it out over many years, over many decades, and truly did become a great leader as he matured. But not in these years, he was really struggling.
We're talking with Peter Stark, the author of Young Washington. Let me ask you this question. If you went into your book and changed the name of Washington to Person X and said Person X went into the Ohio wilderness on this diplomatic mission, and Person X nearly drowned, and Person X was involved in the Jumonville massacre, and Person X had to surrender at a place he called Fort Necessity, and went through this whole story with Person X, you wouldn't necessarily at the end say this is one of the greatest men in American history and this is somebody that was already a man of great achievement. It's a story of vanity, a man who was obsessed with ambition, prickly, always wanting to resign, threatening to resign, never feeling he's getting the respect he deserves. So what's the, how does this is, if you read this with Person X and not knowing that it's George Washington, you might say this is a very stumbling and imperfect beginning, and it'd be interesting to see what happens to this guy's career thereafter. Did it strike you as how different this Washington is from any part of the national mythology?
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, this is so hugely different from our national mythology, and of course, as we all know, our national mythology is this really statuesque, marble version of George Washington. It's as if he kind of sprang out of the ether as a great leader. That's that he's immaculately conceived and arrives among us as this kind of man god, fully formed. He's going to guide our nation's birth in our early years. But, of course, as we know, he didn't become commander-in-chief of the Continental Army until he was 43 years old. And before that, he had a really very different career. And given these early indications, you would never guess that he would end up where he ended up and the leader that he became. I think the only indication that would be really glaring from all the research I've done into these early years is that he was extremely, extremely ambitious from a young age, and he was also very focused from a young age, and he could put himself to a task and really commit himself to that task, and he could teach himself. He was self-taught, self-educated. So those qualities really jump out early and make, those are the kind of the tip-offs that he might really be going places eventually, decades later.
You want to say that he also had tremendous physical stamina, and in a certain sense he did, but your book also indicates that he had some very significant digestive problems during this period and had to ride on a donut essentially for a period. And I mean, the idea that Washington had the greatest stamina of anyone of the Revolution doesn't altogether hold up, does it?
Not at all. And I mean, he did have amazing physical stamina. I think almost even more than the physical stamina, he had amazing bravery. That really jumps out during this period. He is utterly fearless, and that carried through all the way through his career. But in terms of the stamina, he had what they call in those days bloody flux, which was what we know as dysentery, and it was very prevalent in army campsites because of the poor sanitation and water being contaminated. And so he suffered from that a lot during these early years. And at one point, this is later in these early years, after he's been in the wilderness for a few years, that it appears to me that his health actually breaks under the stress. And he becomes so sick that he just goes back to Mount Vernon, and he actually writes a letter saying, I think I'm retiring from public life and I will not be in public life again. And this is at age 27.
So when I read this book, which, by the way, is exceptionally readable and well written, like all of your work, I came away feeling a little sorry for Robert Dinwiddie. The poor governor is being bombarded with these whining, self-indulgent, self-pitying, critical letters from George Washington. There had to be times when he was just ready to wash his hands of this young guy.
Yeah, well, exactly. And at times he tried to, or he suggested that not exactly to wash his hands, but telling George to chill out, go back to your post. That you read these letters, and as you know, I quote a number of them in my book, Young Washington, that they're just, as you say, they're whiny, and you could just feel Governor Dinwiddie rolling his eyes as another letter comes in from George in the wilderness, whining about his pay, that he's not getting enough allotment for his table and his liquor supply, that his rank is not what it should be, and there's this guy who thinks he's a rival in his rank, but he shouldn't be a rival in his rank, and on and on and on. It just never ending. And that I think Governor Dinwiddie very much wanted to wash his hands of young Washington, and in the end, he really did. I mean, by the time the governor finally went back to England, and this was near the end of Washington's service in this time, the French and Indian War, the governor just didn't even really bother with him. He just said, George wanted to go down and visit the governor at Williamsburg, and the governor wrote back and said, "You don't have any business here. You stay where you are."
You just get the sense that he kind of wore Dinwiddie out, and Dinwiddie sort of sought early retirement just to get away from all of this.
Right,
but the other thing that's really struck me, Peter, is mobility. So you write in the book, well, Washington is out in the Ohio country, and then he decides he needs to go to Williamsburg. So he goes to Williamsburg, and then he's almost to Williamsburg, and he hears a dispatch that things are bad on the Ohio frontier. So he turns around before getting to Williamsburg and rides back. And when you read this, you think, using 21st century ideas, well, he got on the next plane. But he didn't, of course. These are horses, and going through really inadequate infrastructure with these inns. And I think at one point you say that he came back to the more civilized parts of Virginia, and he had hoped that he would be at an inn where there would be fresh sheets. Just the sense you get. How did he get log so many miles in this way?
Well, this is another intriguing part of his character during this period. Well, I should preface this by saying, he was a great athlete, and he actually did have an incredible throwing arm. That legend is true. And he was a really good horseman, a really good rider, and so he loved to ride. So he was able to ride long distances on horses, and he had a bunch of horses and a bunch of horses he liked that he would take along with him on some of these journeys. But the intriguing part is that that he feels like a guy who is so dissatisfied with where he is and what he's doing that he can't really sit still in any one spot for very long. And he did not stay at his post in his wilderness post where he was in charge for more than 3 weeks at a stretch. He was a dissatisfied young man.
We're talking with Peter Stark, author of Young Washington. We need to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Hello, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson between these segments of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, inviting you to be part of the Thomas Jefferson Hour Book Club. As you know, we are looking somewhat formally at a number of books this year, and the next on the list is Jefferson's only published book, Notes on the State of Virginia. It was an answer to a set of questionnaires, but Jefferson turned it into an American classic, a kind of encyclopedia/almanac/love song to his Virginia, which extended at that time all the way from the Atlantic at least to the Rocky Mountains and maybe beyond. So Notes on the State of Virginia. You can join us by sending in your comments or your questions or your thoughts, but we need them by April 15th so that we can include them in the book club program on Notes on the State of Virginia. Go to our website, jeffersonhour.com, and you'll find all the details. But let us know what you think about Jefferson's only published book, the classic Notes on the State of Virginia. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
This week, a conversation with historian Peter Stark, Young Washington, How Wilderness and War Forged America's Founding Father. A fascinating new book about the young George Washington.
When we took our break, we were talking with Peter Stark about how restless young George Washington was, and you followed up, Clay, with observations about how difficult travel was. Let's rejoin the conversation now.
But you know, when we think about this, it's hard for us to put ourselves in this world where travel is so easy for us and so instantaneous. This would be, I'm trying to think of an analogy, but it'd be like canoeing from Williston, North Dakota to Bozeman to have a meeting with someone against the current of the Yellowstone River.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's exactly that kind of thing that we do take it for granted so much. And you know, these trails that a lot of these are, especially over the Appalachians, they're terrible trails. I mean, they call them roads, but really they're more like rocky, muddy trails going through the woods and the wilderness. And George would ride on those for days and days at a time. And there were certain inns along the way. They called them ordinaries, and where, you know, they were kind of, some were nice and some were crude, and you could get a bed and a meal, and, you know, he'd end up staying in a lot of those places. But these journeys, they would take days, the routine ones, and the long ones would take weeks and weeks. And yeah, we get on a plane or we have internet. So simply sending a letter in those circumstances took days and days.
This must have been a man of incredible, I guess stamina is the term, but to get on a horse and go 400 miles for a meeting, and then to get on that same horse a few days later and go 400 miles back. I mean, there's no Holiday Inn Express on this road.
No, not at all. Yeah, it's, you know, I mean, there is this remarkable stamina. I mean, even though he had these periods of fragile health.
Well, no wonder.
But he had the physical ability to go through a lot of difficult situations in the wilderness. And initially, that he had to learn how to do that. That he had some, you know, real serious blunders when he was in his first wilderness trips. He didn't know what he was doing, but he eventually learned.
The image of Washington that emerges from this book is not altogether admirable, and what one feels in reading it is that this was a deeply insecure human being.
Exactly. Deeply insecure is exactly the description.
Why?
Well, I've said, again, this is my own interpretation, but you know, I really saturated myself in this period of his life for 4 years of my own life. And that I think if he'd had a more stable immediate family or more present immediate family, it wouldn't have been this way. He wouldn't have been so insecure. His father died when he was 11 years old. His father, Gus, died. His older half-brother, Lawrence, whom he absolutely revered, Lawrence died when Lawrence was young, in his 20s, and George was, I don't know, 19 or 20, somewhere around there. And he never had a good relationship with his mother. It was a distant and strained relationship. And so I've thought that, if he had more of an anchoring in the world from his family, more reassurance of where he stood, he wouldn't have been thrashing around so much in these early years trying to make a name for himself, because he really thrashes trying to make a name for himself. So I think that's part of where his deep insecurity comes from.
Peter, I have to tell you how much I enjoyed reading your descriptions early in the book, some of the adventures, if you want to call it that he had. There's one particular instance where he's coming back from the Ohio Valley, and he and another gentleman decide that they're going to leave the main group and try to make better time. Your description of them going through the woods at night and trying to cross frozen streams and building rafts, and Washington falling into the stream and nearly drowning. I mean, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but it reads like a movie script.
Well, when you read those journals, if you really read them closely, and if you do have experience in some of these wilderness situations, which I do, I mean, I've paddled canoes down half-frozen rivers, and that's the kind of new research I can bring to the story is to be able to appreciate the remarkable experiences that he went through, and running, thinking they're being chased by Indians, running through a frozen, snowy forest at night, navigating by the stars and the moon, and getting thrown off a raft into a half-frozen river, and spending the night on an island. I mean, he really almost died there. It was his wilderness guide, Christopher Gist, who I'm sure really saved Washington, saved the future founding father of our country in that moment, because he would have frozen to death sitting on this island in soaking wet clothes at a night that's probably right around 0 degrees, if his wilderness guide hadn't got a fire going. And I know Washington, you go into a river like that in the winter and you try to start, you can't even bend your fingers, much less start a fire.
You describe the struggle with trying to get a fire going under conditions like that, and then you share what was sort of an emergency way of getting a fire going if you couldn't use flint and steel.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that was a technique to start an emergency fire, is that you can with your musket or your pistol, you put in a bit of lint in the barrel, and then you fire it, and the lint comes out flaming, and that's what you use as your tinder to start your fire. So that might have been what they used to get their fire going on that island.
It's a great description. The other thing that I really kind of opened my eyes, which is not in the Adventure River part, is that his time, I think you said it was 6 weeks that he spent in the tropics. He went with his sick brother.
Right.
That was a pretty formative period for him, you say.
Yes, and that was, I think, a real outlier in his life in a lot of ways. He never went overseas, other than that one period when he was right around the age of 20. And his older brother, Lawrence, the one whom he revered, was very ill with tuberculosis and went to the island of Barbados in the Caribbean as a cure. The tropical air was supposed to do him good. And Barbados was one of the real centers of the British Empire, with the big stone fort and the governor's mansion and on and on and on. And George and brother Lawrence were invited to be part of that real, British Imperial Society and the Royal Navy Society. And so they were, young George, he'd never seen anything like this. He was having dinner with governors and admirals, and it opened up this world, a much wider world than Tidewater, Virginia, where he'd been for almost his entire life.
And what I took away from that was that, he saw this life outside of his own, and it marked him to the point where I think you're right. When he came back, he came to Williamsburg, and
I mean, he was sort of snide about coming back to Williamsburg after this trip to Barbados, and his ship lands in Williamsburg finally, and he snidely calls it something like the phrase something like, the thriving metropolis of Williamsburg, and he's obviously being utterly facetious about what a podunk town it is after where he's been.
I want to turn to this fascinating incident, something that happened in 1754, May 28th, 1754. I was utterly fascinated by your account of it. Explain what happened.
Well, I should preface it by saying there are a number of accounts of this battle from various sides, or this incident. You wouldn't call it a full-on battle, including George Washington's. And so there's no one like absolute, this is what happened account. And I spent a long time piecing together various accounts and trying to figure out which was most plausible and kind of the through line of action. I mean, how these people would actually move around physically over this landscape where I've been, this beautiful remote glen in Western Pennsylvania. So what happened was George, after he came out of the wilderness, after his journey, his mission to deliver the message to the French commandant, he gets out of the wilderness, gets back to Dinwiddie, and the French commandant has sent a letter saying, no way, we're not leaving this wilderness. This is ours. And so the Dinwiddie, outraged, Governor Dinwiddie, sends George back into the wilderness at the head of a small military party. And he's also, Governor Dinwiddie is going to follow up with a lot more troops, the Virginia Regiment troops, who are actually supposed to be led by Joshua Fry, Peter Jefferson's partner in mapping. So George is sent back with a small body of troops into the wilderness to essentially deliver a firmer message to the French that get out. This is British territory. And Governor Dinwiddie warns him, tells him to be cautious and not to be the aggressor. Well, young George, in his brazen ambition, does just the opposite. He's way back in the wilderness, with a small group of troops, and he hears from one of his Indian guides that there is a party of French camped nearby, and they're hiding in the woods, and that they're surely going to attack George and his party. And so George decides to attack them first, basically. And he and his men on a rainy night go stalking through the woods, and they're, of course, they're getting wrapped in the face by wet branches, and they lose the trail and on and on. And they eventually get to this wooded glen at dawn. And George, this is a key element, and he admits it himself, he arranges his troops in a way so they can attack from all sides. And this glen, it's like a little canyon, basically, in the woods, kind of with a rocky rim, maybe 30 feet high, and a sort of a flat, woody bottom down below. So George gets all his men come sneaking over the rim of this thing at dawn, on this rainy dawn. And what's down below are a bunch of French guys, like, 35 of them. They're still sleeping, and they're making breakfast. Well, George and his guys open fire on this camp. There's a lot of argument later about who fired the first shot. It was clear that George gave his men at least two orders to shoot volleys on these guys down below. And these guys are scrambling around trying to get their guns and figure out what happened. The way it unfolds is that there are a bunch of French wounded in the glen after the smoke clears, and the French officer in charge, Ensign Jumonville, calls out, and they say, we have a message for you, a diplomatic message. We are a diplomatic party, a French diplomatic party, and we're trying to deliver you a message. Things pause. Two parties start coming together, and in the course of this the French letter is being translated, or it's being delivered, or whatever, but it's a diplomatic situation. But one of the Indian guides with Washington's party goes up behind the wounded French officer, Ensign Jumonville, and he slams his tomahawk down on Jumonville's skull, splits it open, pulls out his brains, and kneads Jumonville's brains through his fingers. And at about the same time, the rest of the Indians with the Half King's Indian guide and leader scalped the remaining French dead and wounded, and they cut off one French soldier's head and put it on a post. And this whole horrific scene unfolds, instantly, kind of before George's eyes. And, it's clear that he had no idea it was going to unfold this way, that his approach to this party, what he thought was going to attack him, it ends up being a diplomatic party. It ends up being this big mess. He ends up taking the remaining French guys prisoner. And, of course, at this point in his ambition, you would think a prudent officer would pause at this point, kind of figure out what to do next. But George just kind of keeps marching forward, more or less.
Well, let me ask you a couple of questions about this incident.
Go ahead.
Number one, Washington fires down upon this party without asking any questions, without asking them to surrender.
Exactly.
So unprovoked, he shoots first and asks questions later. Secondly, this is a diplomatic group, so under what would amount to the equivalent of the Geneva Conventions of the day, they are entitled to be treated with military respect.
Exactly.
Number three, then when they get down there, they've shot and wounded before asking a single question or inviting a parley or urging surrender. They get down there, and then the half king, this Native American, comes up and splits the skull of the leader of this diplomatic detachment, and then taunts him by kneading his brains over his corpse. Surely Washington did not intend that.
I suspect he was horrified by what happened, how it went out of control so quickly. But he could have very easily approached the French in an entirely different and much more peaceful way by sending his own emissary into the French camp, by coming in a way where he wasn't distributing his soldiers to attack on all sides. So the moment they poked their heads above the rim, they opened fire. You couldn't help but provoke a major incident by approaching this French party, the way Washington did.
So this effectively touches off the French and Indian War.
It effectively touches off the French and Indian War. Of course, there are a lot of underlying tensions, and France and Britain had been at war for about 700 years in Europe, but they were enjoying a brief period of peace in Europe. But tensions were mounting in North America over this whole Ohio, who owned the Ohio Valley. But it didn't have to go up in flames at this moment. And, George has a direct responsibility for, as one British commentator of the day put it, lit the spark that set the world on fire, because it morphed into the French and Indian War in North America, and then it spread globally around the continental Europe and French and British colonies around the world as the 7 Years' War, and it literally lasted 7 years.
So Washington precipitates this war, probably would have come to pass one way or another. In his report, Washington is not candid about exactly what happened in this affair, right?
Yes, and that's one of the kind of the wildest things about this whole era and young George Washington. We were talking earlier about how he's whined so much to Governor Dinwiddie, complains about this and that. So after this horrific incident occurs with Jumonville, he goes straight back to his camp, which is some miles away, and the first thing, and he sits down to write Governor Dinwiddie a letter. And this letter, it goes on and on with all these petty complaints to Governor Dinwiddie. And then there's one paragraph or so at the end where he describes in very general terms, oh yeah, we ran into these French guys and we defeated them and took them prisoners. And so, we came out ahead of that one. So,
Peter, I don't know how to say this any other way. This seems to me an unconscionable atrocity.
The French certainly saw it that way. I mean, they thought it was an assassination, a war crime, that Washington was a murderer, and especially because it was the commanding officer, Jumonville, was tomahawked. And of course, George didn't do that, and he didn't order it, but that's what happened. His approach was so wrong, at least in my estimation of how this unfolded. And so this terrible thing happened. And yet he gives this to Governor Dinwiddie, this very whitewashed account. It's just very brief, and in either in that letter or one soon thereafter, or a footnote to that letter, he says, well, these prisoners are coming, I'm sending them back to you, and don't let them tell you any smooth stories. You know, these guys were all a bunch of skulking spies hiding in low places, ready to attack.
We're talking with the author Peter Stark about his newest book, Young Washington: How Wilderness and War Forged America's Founding Father. We need to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Hello, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson. In between these segments of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, let me invite you to next year's Winter Humanities Retreats at Locksaw Lodge, just west of Missoula, Montana. The first is The Imagination of Charles Dickens, January 12th through 17th. And the second one is Exploring the Space Program, January 18th through 23rd. These are the book club you always wanted to be part of in a magnificent winter wonderland. It's not cold, but there is some snow, and we sit around a fire drinking eggnog and hot chocolate, talking about some of the most interesting books and interesting ideas in American life. The first of them, Charles Dickens, January 12th through 17th, 2020, and Exploring the American Space Program, January 18th through 23rd. Go to the website jeffersonhour.com/tours for all the details. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We've been talking with Peter Stark, the author of Young Washington, about the Jumonville incident, 1754, the incident that touched off the French and Indian War.
And Mr. Stark writes that so well.
It's one of my favorite episodes, and it also allows us to talk about the changing way in which history is understood from generation to generation.
Let's rejoin that conversation now.
We're talking with Peter Stark, the author of Young Washington: How Wilderness and War Forged America's Founding Father. So let me ask you a bigger question about historiography. There must be 100 accounts of this. There might be 1,000 accounts of this. You've read them. You've read a lot of them to prepare. I'm guessing that from 1754 until, say, 1980, almost every account effectively whitewashed this incident, and only recently has the historiography turned enough that you can safely write so stark an account of this story.
Yes, and that's, I think, a very perceptive observation about the historiography. That, yes, you read very little about what happened. David Preston, who's a military war historian at the Citadel and wrote a book called Braddock's Defeat, did a lot of research in archives abroad for his book, which takes place during the French and Indian War. And in the French archives, he found a document in which an Iroquois warrior had given testimony about what happened at this Jumonville incident. And this document the Iroquois warrior testified that George Washington himself fired the first shot. So that evidence is just coming to light, literally in the last few years.
Peter, after the Jumonville incident, Washington wrote a letter to his younger brother Jack talking about what had happened. The letter became fairly famous. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, and that's another one of these curious psychological and emotional aspects of this Jumonville incident.
I think it's very telling. It gives us some more insight into young Washington.
I think it's very telling, exactly. Right after this incident, again, just within the next few days, young George writes his younger brother Jack a letter in which he says, describing this incident, he says, "I heard bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound." And so you get this impression of this sort of cocky young guy. And
it's just what a big brother would write to a little brother, though, right?
Right. Well, it's like I went through this amazing thing, and it was like really cool. And yet there was this, all sorts of slaughter that had gone on. And at the same time, Washington writes a letter to Governor Dinwiddie that says, well, if the French can put up no more resistance than this, we'll drive them back to and then he puts parentheses, which means with a D, which means we'll drive them back to damned Montreal. So, here's this guy kind of strutting around beating his chest. And I've wondered if he really felt that way. I mean, I suspect he felt this whole mixture of emotions, partly horror, partly pride. How did he react when it first happened? Or did he kind of convince himself that this was, an amazing victory on his part over the next few days? So it's very telling it's a young man trying to come to grips with this event.
Your book is about young Washington, but there's so much more in it that I just found fascinating. You talk about when His Majesty's warships and transport dropped anchor at Alexandria on March 22nd, and how the colonists had never really seen the British Army before. And the interaction, the Carlyle in his letter about the British soldiers calling the citizens of America the spawn of convicts, and so there's so many, it is young Washington, but there's so many incidents that you write about, particularly when the British first arrive, that I just found fascinating. Congrats on that.
Well, thanks so much. Well, and I think that's part of the fascination of this story. And this period is that the cross-cultural interaction is so dramatic and profound. I mean, on the Native American side and the British and the American side.
But it really started there in Alexandria, didn't it?
Well, it started there in Alexandria when the actual, British redcoats land in March 1755. And, there are thousands, some of them, and, 18 ships and all sorts of, cannons and everything else. And, here are these guys, and they're the British Royal Army is a really formal thing. And they're dressed in their red coats, and they follow their own orders. And their officers they're born aristocrats. And there is this real contempt for Americans, for the colonists, which is a theme that runs through this whole period, and it's a theme that runs through Washington's life, and it's a theme that's deeply embedded in him, his resentment towards that attitude, that he feels like a second-class citizen, if you even want to call him a citizen, when he's in the presence of the actual British Empire, and it's a very telling.
At the end of your book, on the last chapter before the postscript, you talk a little bit about what motivated George Washington to be a Revolutionary War leader in the United States, and you suggest that these resentments about the way the British treated all of us, but particularly how they treated the colonial regiments and the colonial militias and the colonial officers, was one of the fuels of resentment that stayed with him for the rest of his life.
Very much, very much, and it's a very clear strain that runs through this period of his life, and including I've just been researching some of his land investments out at Western, out of the West, meaning out in the Ohio Valley, and I could call it up, but there's a quote where in 1774 he is so bitter about the British because they might take away what he considers his bounty lands, the lands he was awarded for the French and Indian War service, and the British are saying, well, we might only give those lands to actual Royal Army officers, and George was not one, and so he's extremely bitter.
Speaking of which, Peter, so Dinwiddie and Washington both have shares or stakes in the Ohio Company, land speculation plans. These, of course, were existing all over the colonies, but is there any way for you to sort out the balance between Commonwealth interests, true patriotism, working on behalf of the British cause, and then personal speculation and protecting one's own holdings in the minds of someone like George Washington?
I'm not sure George himself was actual stockholder in the Ohio Company, at least in this early phase. But his brother Lawrence was one of the founders, and I think another older half brother was also a shareholder. So he was very much involved. His family was very much involved with the Ohio Company, which was this land investment company in the Western lands. And I will preface this by saying, I think George Washington became a great and selfless leader of both troops and of our nation in its early years, and a remarkable leader. When it came to land dealings, he was really aggressive and not always entirely above board.
Back to the charming sound or feeling of the bullet whistling near one's head. Isn't it George II who said, well, he ain't heard many of them then?
Right. I know. I love that quote. And I don't know if it may be apocryphal, but I think it's probably actual, that somehow that letter that George wrote to his younger brother, Jack, was made public and was published in London in some fashion. And King George himself, when he read the quote, supposedly responded, he would not say so if he heard many. And King George turned out to be quite foreseeing on that part, because George would soon hear many, and the sound probably lost its charm pretty fast.
That leads to the thought of Providence and Washington. A point you make 4 or 5 times in the book is that because he had these near-death experiences and the bullet didn't hit him in the head while he saw people going down around him all the time, that he came to believe that he had I want to put this carefully, but that Providence, with a capital P, had a special destiny for him.
Yes, and this, after Braddock's defeat, the Battle of the Monongahela, George manages to survive this as a young aide-de-camp to General Braddock, with 4 bullet holes through his coat and his hat. And he's performed very bravely, and he survived, whereas almost every other British officer was killed. And he writes again to his younger brother Jack after this battle, and he says, it's beyond all human understanding how I survived. It's only the intervention of divine providence. That's the only way I can explain it. And I think this is one of the key moments in young George Washington's life, and there's several others, but one of the key moments where his sense of himself starts spreading out to a much larger role, a much greater role for himself, and a much greater sense of empathy for other people. And so instead of being so utterly self-centered about his career and his promotions and on, he starts thinking of himself as having a larger role in the big scheme of things. And I think that's a key moment right there.
Peter, do you think Washington would have accomplished as much in his life, leading the nation, winning the revolution, if he hadn't experienced all the things you detail in your book?
No, I do not. I think that these were extremely formative in the leader that he became. And one of the great things that he learned during this period, or started learning, was this sense of bondedness and empathy for his officers and for his men. And it comes through in a few remarkable moments, especially during this period. And likewise, this sense of having a kind of a greater mission, that if he hadn't had this previous experience, that he might have still been on a more self-centered track. And by the same token, he became a much more cautious leader, and he learned to consult with his officers very closely before making any major decision. And I think that's what I was just looking up in the book, my book, about what President Jefferson said about George Washington. And perhaps President Jefferson in last week addressed this very quote, but I'll read it here. Perhaps the strongest feature in his character was prudence, Thomas Jefferson would write of Washington, never acting until every circumstance, every consideration was maturely weighed. And as I write, that George Washington lay very far in the future from this era that I'm writing about, but he got there, and it was through the difficulties of this era And I think it's all the more inspirational that he started here and ended up there.
We've gotten an hour into this, and I'm going to say the following phrase for the first time: Sally Fairfax. I think we deserve some credit for that. So he's about to marry one of the wealthiest widows in Virginia, Martha Custis. A few weeks before that, he writes this sort of Hail Mary pass letter to Sally Fairfax. It has to be done in very careful 18th century code, but he says, "You're the one, and were conditions right, that's what I want."
And the letter that he writes, he's about to go into the wilderness where thinking it's going to be the final showdown with the French and the Indians, and he might die and he might not die. And he writes this letter to Sally Fairfax, whom he's been infatuated with since his late teens, that says, really, what I really have to know, and this is, of course, somewhat interpreted, but what I really have to know is whether you love me or not. And she writes him back a letter, which is not exactly Dear John, but it doesn't answer his question by any means. It's kind of a newsy letter.
She carefully puts him down.
And then he writes her again, and he says, "Madame, do you not understand my meaning?" And I mean, he really wants to know. And then he goes into the wilderness, and as soon as the French are pried out of the wilderness, Washington leaves. He rides back to Virginia. And this all happens very quickly within a few weeks. He rides back to Virginia. He quits he quits the military, and he marries Martha. And he marries Martha 3 or 4 months after writing those letters to Sally Fairfax. And Martha's the richest widow in Virginia with 17,000 acres and dozens of slaves. And Washington moved on. And, by all accounts, Martha and George had a really good marriage, very strong and solid and warm. And I give Martha a huge part of the credit for Washington becoming the guy he became, because I think Martha established George, gave him the sense of security, basically said, George, you don't have to try so hard, kind of like chill out.
He married the wealthy widow woman. I don't think the word infatuation ever comes up in his view of that marriage, but it was a very intelligent marriage and a lifelong partnership, and she became a great partner in his life and a protector of him against things like Jefferson's disloyalty. I'm talking to Peter Stark, the author of Astoria, At the Mercy of the River, Last Breath, The Last Empty Places, and most recently, Young Washington, How Wilderness and War Forged America's Founding Father. You said that took 4 years. May we ask what you're working on now, sir?
Well, I'm right in the middle of proposal limbo, so I won't be too specific, but I will say it's kind of in a way, a sequel to this book, and it has to do with the struggles between the early settlers in the Ohio Valley and the Indian tribes who lived there.
I think Meriwether Lewis is going to come up in this one.
He'll come up in this book. He makes an appearance.
He has to. This is when he emerges on the national stage.
Yeah.
We have so enjoyed talking with you. We'll do it again. Of course, I've met your son out on the river. Can't wait to have dinner with you at one of Missoula's finest Thai restaurants one of these days. Peter Stark, the author of Young Washington. David, this was great, wasn't it?
Yes, thank you so much for taking all this time today to talk to us, Peter, and enjoy your mountain-capped snow view out your window.
And a dog barking in the background.
Yes, I thought we were talking to Joe Ellis there for a minute.
The Black Lab Maggie.
Really, really enjoyed the book. I encourage you to do write more on it. I'm looking forward to your sequel.
Great. Well, thanks so much. It was really fun talking to both of you. And please do join us. Come over on us for a Thai dinner, either at a fine restaurant or in our very house.
Even better if you can produce it yourselves. We'll see you soon. Thank you, Peter Stark. Young Washington, How Wilderness and War Forged America's Founding Father. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you, guys.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.